This brings us to the situation of middle-income countries. Co-President, at present, ACP countries account for approximately 48% of middle-income countries, and it is estimated that by 2030, almost 60% of ACP countries could fall into this category of countries. Despite their level of economic development, however, middle-income ACP countries are still faced with inherent vulnerabilities, whether to exogenous shocks or to weather events which are increasing in frequency and intensity, as well as experiencing challenges in terms of access to sustainable development financing. The capacity to effectively mobilize domestic resources and to diversify sources of financing remains for many limited and costly. These financing difficulties increase when they reach the graduation threshold as defined, both for the progression towards the status of MIC, as well as towards the category of high-income country, which represents a threshold where they lose access to concessional financing. Gross national income per capita as the sole criteria in the classification process and in the allocation of ODA by the World Bank or the OECD's Development Assistance Committee does not effectively reflect the constraints and complexity of the financing challenges faced by middle-income developing countries, middle-income ACP countries, a large number of which are SIDS and which are repeatedly impacted by natural disasters, and as a result of which many are also highly indebted, not as a result of profligacy or poor policy making in all circumstances, but in many circumstances because of the capital-intensive nature of reconstruction after disasters. In this specific context, Co-Presidents, the continuity and predictability of overseas development assistance is relevant and takes on critical importance in the reduction of poverty and inequality. A reflection on development financing in middle-income countries, especially the need for specific financing instruments for MICs, with a view to progressively offsetting the loss of concessional multilateral financing caused by the effects of graduation, would be useful. We look forward to your comments, Co-President.
Thank you, Madam Co-President. The idea of putting these items in under C in our agenda is really to have a not formal, lively discussion, and that's why actually the idea was not to prepare even from outside the talking points. I think we have a great chance discussing post-Cotonou relationship to address these very important challenges. Of course, the countries with middle incomes can also have their own resources and they don't need so much assistance, but let's be frank and honest with us, those countries still have a high number of people living in poverty. And what we have to do, what we started to do with European Investment Plan is really to help the private sector to reform. And that's why the pillar of technical assistance that we just discussed in our previous point in the agenda was so important. Also, to motivate our business to invest in those countries, and that's why we discussed very lively in the Foreign Policy Ministers' Council many times with EIB, and the Commissioner also just a few minutes ago informed you for intention to increase the fund for guarantees that we also support and give additional motivation to our business to invest in those countries. I think it's also very important to make a nexus between humanitarian aid and development programs. Because first assistance, of course, it's sometimes it's very urgent and it comes from humanitarian aid funds. But right after that, we have to engage with funding from development programs. And I think during also our negotiations for post-Cotonou relationship, we should also think about this, how to make stronger the nexus between humanitarian aid and development programs. Just what I think it's important, and I know that some of the ACP countries wasn't happy, but it's very important. The data that we have is that only for Africa, the loss for the governments that mean for the people from not paid taxes, tax fraud or tax avoidance, is $50 billion per year. And I'm sure that this is also, altogether, we should work to tackle this problem, because it's win-win situation. It's not only because you want to punish somebody. No, it's the opposite. We have to work together to create a stable tax systems in ACP countries. So to sum up, first, education, investments, and I think it's particularly important also we to share with you our good practices in social support and social assistance. Of course, we hear from you. I don't have here speakers in all we have. Yes, of course, after Commissioner, yes, and Romania. I now give the floor to the Commissioner, and then Romania's Ambassador? Secretary General, okay.
Thank you, Madam Co-President, Honourable Ministers. We strive to address the needs and circumstances of all developing countries, partners, in a balanced way. The European Union and Member States will continue to target development cooperation primarily where the need is greatest and can have most impact, especially in least developed countries and in situations of fragility and conflict. At the same time, our new European Consensus on Development includes a commitment to engage in development cooperation, policy dialogue and partnerships with middle-income countries. They are crucial partners for implementing the 2030 Agenda. Continuing our cooperation is important, given trends within these countries, such as the prevalence of inequalities and poverty affecting significant parts of the population. We must close remaining gaps. While income inequality between countries may have reduced, inequality within countries has in fact increased. Pockets of fragility remain also in those economies that have succeeded in climbing the economic ladder. In Namibia, for example, which is considered an upper middle income country, just over a quarter of its poorest inhabitants are covered by social protections, whereas Malawi, considered a low-income country, covers over 40%. We want to strengthen our forms of cooperation with middle-income countries to achieve concrete impact towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. We will use a variety of means depending on each country's specific circumstances, including blending and innovative financial instruments, exchange of knowledge and expertise, trade, policy coordination and coherence, and technological cooperation. We also recognize the need to address the challenges of countries moving from low-income to middle-income status, or from lower to upper middle-income countries level. This is one of the reasons why we are promoting a debate around development in transition. The key idea is to go beyond the concept of donors and recipients. The key idea is to gradually transit from money to knowledge. It is about a shared agenda across income levels. The overarching nature of the SDGs and the global nature of development challenges requires new partnerships and new dynamics. We look forward to continuing discussions with you on strengthening partnerships with middle-income ACP countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And now I'll give the floor to Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from Romania.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-President, Honorable Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Étant donné que c'est la première fois que je prends la parole, je voudrais commencer par remercier à nos hôtes pour leur hospitalité et l'organisation très efficace de notre réunion. Un très grand merci. Going back to our point on the agenda, I would like to state that as an emerging donor, Romania has traditionally implemented development assistance programs in middle-income countries, and it continues to be a supporter of effective engagement with countries that fall under this category, so as to address vulnerability and in-country inequalities and to foster cooperation for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. The recent natural disaster that's affected the Caribbean, the hurricanes Maria and Irma, or the Pacific, the Typhoon Gita, show that the vulnerabilities of middle-income countries continue to represent a challenge that needs to be addressed. And while it is important to make sure that unconditional support is offered to least developed countries, it is also important to have the right mechanisms in place to work with middle-income countries, including finding solutions once countries have fulfilled the criteria to upgrade their status. Dear colleagues, Romania will further continue to advocate the appropriate attention to be given to middle-income countries as to address the development challenges that they are facing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ambassador of Spain now has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Spain considers that cooperation with middle-income countries is a key feature of our EU and our bilateral cooperation. And we believe that it will become much more important in the context of the Agenda 2030 implementation, in which no country should be left behind in the pursuit of our common goals and objectives. We do not, however, favor the term middle-income country precisely because we believe that it is too simplistic to base all dimensions of development on one exclusive indicator, income. We consider it as far more important to identify others, as experience has shown that economic growth does not always imply poverty, eradication, or welfare. This is the reason why we support a multidimensional approach to poverty, and we are particularly satisfied with the European Consensus on Development, which has started using the term most advanced development countries. We are speaking about a group of countries that is becoming bigger. As Madam Co-President has highlighted, in 2030, 60% of ACP countries will have reached the middle income status. They are important strategic partners of the EU and have a significant impact in their respective regions. They still, however, have great difficulties, internal inequalities, and vulnerabilities that need to be addressed and managed. In this respect, in Spain's 5th General Cooperation Plan for the period 2018-2021, we have used different criteria in order to identify our cooperation. However, we are speaking also middle-income countries, and amongst them ACP countries, about a very heterogeneous group of countries with different income levels, different dimensions, development levels as well, and with very specific situations. We therefore have to consider a different approach and a tailor-made response to specific situations. Our cooperation with middle-income countries or most advanced development countries, as we prefer, the term we prefer to use, should be a specific and strategic cooperation addressed to these countries, in which different instruments, most of them highlighted by Commissioner Mimica, can be used. Amongst them, South-South cooperation, trade, technical cooperation, innovation, research, professional and vocational training, and others addressed to help these countries overcome the trap of middle-income status, which has to face particular challenges, amongst them, as the co-president has also highlighted, financial challenges obtaining financial aid. We also considered that promoting the growth of this private sector is of particular importance in these countries, as well as cooperation to help them mobilize internal revenues. Lastly, I would like to state that Spain is considering the possibility of organizing a new seminar in Madrid on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alicia. I don't have, Madam Co-President, other speakers in my list.
Thank you, Co-President, and thank you very much for the representatives of both Romania and Spain, and of course for the Commission for the comments made, and in particular for the recognition that, especially by Spain, of the fact that economic growth is not equivalent to poverty eradication, and that there are far more nuances and complexities to be considered than looking at income as a determining factor in one's development status. And of course, looking at the European consensus terminology of most advanced developing country and whether that in fact is a more appropriate term, recognizing the complexities. The recommendations, or rather the proposals made to ensure that specific approaches as outlaid by the Commission and some addressed by Spain as well in respect of trade, technical cooperation, professional and vocational training as methods of promoting growth and of course supporting the private sector. And Romania, of course, for recognizing the need for development support and in particular the vulnerability of countries such as small island developing states in the Caribbean and Pacific, in particular to weather events such as experienced last year. We thank you for those comments and open the floor on the ACP side. The first subscription being by Botswana. Honorable Minister, you have the floor. Botswana.
Co-Presidents, Honorable Ministers, Excellencies, distinguished guests, Agenda Item 12 is a substantive issue which deserves to be brought above the line to be items for a decision. Middle-income countries face challenges of unemployment, poverty, and income inequalities. In short, middle-income countries face these same problems confronting most of the developing countries. It is therefore necessary to give these problems a serious consideration. In the next 20 to 30 years, if not earlier, most least developed countries should have graduated to middle-income status. They would need accompanying measures to avoid the loss and possible reversal of the gains that have been achieved over the years. Middle-income countries such as my own, Botswana, are confronted by the problems of lack of infrastructure and undiversified economies and low levels of industrialization. The cost of infrastructure development is high. For Botswana, with a small population but a vast territory, the per capita cost of infrastructure development is very high. In addition, we would have to deal with the harsh climate conditions which manifest themselves in the form of severe, prolonged, and frequent drought. These affect crop production, livestock, and tourism. Middle-income countries need consistent and assured support to enable them to escape the so-called middle-income trap. Some of the assistance is not necessarily in monetary form. Greater effort should be made to help countries diversify their economies through private sector development. Botswana is calling for the assistance in human capital development, infrastructure development, capacity development for the private sector, development of new technologies as well as information and communication technologies. As a middle-income country, Botswana recognizes that there are countries that are in greater need of assistance. In the SADC region, 10 of the 16 member states are least developed countries. We strongly support that substantial and effective official development assistance be extended to those countries. In the wider African continent, which has a large number of LDCs, we call for a greater effort to help these countries overcome the difficulties of underdevelopment so that they can firmly embark on the path to sustainable development. The development of the LDCs is in our best interest. In this regard, Botswana is actively involved in the South-South and triangular cooperation. We call for intensified North-South cooperation to complement South-South cooperation. Co-President, Honorable Ministers, in the negotiations of the post-Cotonou relations between the ACP and the EU, I wish to emphasize the vital importance of an inclusive partnership that leaves no country behind. The advancement of the middle-income countries is crucial as it will contribute in no small measure to the growth of the global economy. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that contribution, Botswana, and for so eloquently outlining the issues at hand. Seychelles, Honourable Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Co-President. Madam Co-President, this is an example of a subject, the situation of middle-income countries, that should be of common interest to both sides, and that we should jointly work together in the international financial system to address. The debate that we've been having has been there since the 70s. Today, we're in 2018. We are still having the debate. True, we have become more conscious of the complexity of the situation. But we have advanced very little in making the change happen. What is required, I would like to submit, is that we stop using this nomenclature. As Spain has rightly said, we should opt for other approaches, like the multidimensional approach. The Seeds have been using the Vulnerability and Resilience Index, and we've been pushing for this change in the international development and financial architecture. We need to get the Bretton Woods institutions, we need to get the OECD and the DAC to change their posture on this question. The single use of GDP per capita to measure the level of development or to elect to decide whether a country should benefit from official development assistance should be changed, and should be changed this year. If we work together, if we put our minds together, we work on a work program where we jointly work, as we did for the climate change, we work to get these institutions to change the use of this criteria. We need a new approach, either a multidimensional approach or a vulnerability and resilience index approach, as we do in the case of, as we've been promoting in the case of the SIDS. This is what is required. I would like to welcome and congratulate the EU for coming up with a new set of tools like blending and the other instruments that have been used. This is a step in the right direction, but it will not take us very far if we do not get those institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, to change this criteria. we may use the classifications just to measure, as an indicator to measure how we have progressed as countries, but not to decide whether a country should qualify for development assistance. Okay, we are, Seychelles has moved from a MIC to now a high income level country. But if there is an extreme weather condition that happens tomorrow, what's going to happen with infrastructure? It's going to be destroyed, because 80% of our economic activities are on the coastal side of our country, which is, as you know, an archipelago. And of course, we will have to incur debt again, as we did in the 90s and in early 2000, and it will bring us back again. So there is a need for us to get the Bretton Woods institutions to change the use of the definition of development on the single use of GDP per capita criteria. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Seychelles. And if I may just invoke Chair's privilege to endorse your call for fundamental review of how it is that the Bretton Woods institutions define graduation. It has not been lost on many of our administrations, I believe, at the beginning of a conversation with representatives of developed countries, which question, or who question rather, why would you object to being designated or called a middle-income country? Isn't that a good thing? And you say, of course that's a good thing if it is that it's reflective truly of development, when the implications thereof are such that they have been defined by another body that has not taken into concern or to consideration the true realities of your economic status and your developmental status. So we appreciate the comments as we move to the Honorable Minister of Guyana for your contribution. Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-President. Madam Co-President, I'd like to make some additional comments on this item because I believe it is an especially important item to us. I'd like to start by observing that one of the distinctive and indeed one of the most enviable features of our compact as a North-South compact is attributable to the fact that the instruments together employed on the Lomé and Cotonou are instruments that cater for developing countries with a wide range of characteristics and with diverse needs. And we need to remember that as we try to refine the tools to be employed in the post-Cotonou era. Now, I was very heartened at the observations I heard from the European side, some in response to the earlier comments made by yourself and Namibia regarding the plight of middle-income countries. And I'm of the impression that many of those comments suggest that there is a very good understanding of the nuances and subtleties that lie behind this category of countries, and that some of the characteristics are significant, and it is those that make it important, not only that we don't depend on a single criterion, such as, for example, per capita income, but that there are some structural things associated with this group, which structures ought to inform the approach towards resolving the issues that we face. And I would just like to emphasize, not because they haven't been mentioned, but just so that we bear these in mind. This group of countries, I think, find that they are working under the shadow, for the most part, of graduation. Graduation has implications for access to financial resources. We recognize, of course, that you can say and make pledges to do a range of things, but most of them require financial resources. And one of the important features of the current partnership is, of course, the grant-financed multi-annual development assistance allocation, which is disbursed through the mechanism of the National Indicative Program. I want to say that graduation, in the context of a discussion of development, particularly of these categories of countries, makes no sense if there is not provision for additional or alternative access to resources. And in this regard, the comments made, some of them merely in passing, I mentioned especially Mr. Mansavisi's observations about use of domestic mobilization of financial resources is a very important one. If I might say in that regard, that if the enthusiasm that the OECD countries, including the EU, show for the pursuit of problems in the context of the tax evasion mechanisms, if that enthusiasm could be applied in relation to our own compact, then I think we could go a long way. And what I mean by this is that when we speak of tax evasion and tax avoidance, we should not forget that this is not a one-sided mechanism, nor is it restricted to the ACP country taxpayers alone. We have the problem of multinational corporations, of EU corporations operating in ACP countries. And one of the concrete things we could do to enhance mobilization would be cooperation with these middle-income countries to ensure that the entities, the corporations working across the borders of the EU and ACP are brought to the point where they pay a fair share of their tax obligations. And this is especially important if we bear in mind, of course, and as recognized by our partners on the other side, that income inequality between these countries is an important issue. When you measure GDP as opposed to GNP, and you don't take into account income inequality, then you assume that countries have per capita incomes to share amongst its citizens, when in fact a good deal of that income is transferred abroad through profits and remittances and the like. And so this is one reason why we have to pay attention to that dimension. I've note also the suggestion that the private sector play a larger role here, and I can't but agree with that. I would say also that this is an area in which cooperation between the two sides can help in helping to ensure that capacity on the ACP side will put them in a position to work more constructively in support and in promotion of private sector activities, so that their support can be more focused. One of the challenges for many of the developing countries is indeed working with private sectors, especially national private sectors, which are often as perhaps as weak as our states are in terms of a variety of things, ranging from pricing to the efficiency of their own operations. So, Madam Co-President, what I'm urging here is that, first of all, alongside the various focuses that the EU is proposing, that we try to ensure that the National Indicative Program mechanism, which has a grant financed element, that be maintained as a complement, especially in circumstances where the loan financing instruments that we are looking to may not have yet been perfected. We need to pay some attention to designing these more carefully, and therefore the importance of continuing with predictable and stable resources such as the NIPs be put in place. And I'm saying, secondly, that cooperation between the two sides should focus on some of those areas where the mobilization of domestic finances is seen as an effective tool, and in that regard, cooperation would be useful because the skills of the EU in regard to this area are skills that I think can help, together with their knowledge and awareness and complementary implementation of how the corporations which are operating in ACP countries and out of the EU states, how they manage their books, the whole issue of transfer pricing and the movement of profits from different profit centers in order to avoid and evade taxes. We know that this is a big issue, and that in the global arena today, this is one that is looming very large. So these are my observations, Madam Co-President. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for your usual thorough approach and the recommendations made for consideration. South Africa is my next subscription on this side. Excellency, South Africa, you have the floor.
No, thank you very much, Madam Chairperson, Madam Co-Chair. I will be really very brief because I do believe that your good self, the honorable ministers from Botswana, Seychelles, and Guyana have ventilated the matter that we wanted to express. Really to point to the fact that the gross national income per capita can never be the measure for the development of our communities, of our societies, and that we need collaborative approaches other than unilateralism in determining the way forward in this complex matter. So to that extent, Madam Co-Chairperson, thank you very much. I'm in full support of the statements expressed by ACP ministers.
Thank you, Excellency. Despite my desire to so do, I will not again invoke chairperson's privilege on this particular point, and simply ask, given that there are no further interventions, that Council take note of the deliberations on this important subject, this very important subject, and that we congratulate the contributors to the deliberations for their insightful interventions, some which are of, I believe, fundamental importance and requiring deeper interrogation and deeper reflection. And with that, Co-President, if you are minded, we could recommit the preceding item and conclude on that item before moving to agenda item 13.